It was late summer in Chicago, and I had just moved into a new apartment in the Lakeview neighborhood. The city was buzzing with life, and I was feeling excited to explore and meet new people. I'd been on Tinder for a while and had met some nice guys, but nothing really stuck. Then one evening I matched with Jake. Jake was everything you'd want in a match. He was charming, good-looking, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. His profile said he was 32, a marketing executive, and a big fan of hiking and photography. We started chatting and the conversation flowed easily. He asked thoughtful questions, shared funny anecdotes, and seemed to really click with me. After a few days of messaging, we decided to meet up for drinks at a bar in Wicker Park. The date went well, almost too well. Jake was even more charismatic in person, and we talked for hours. He was attentive, complimented me on my interests, and made me feel like I was the only person in the room. At the end of the night, he walked me to my car, and we parted ways with a hug. Over the next couple of weeks, we went on a few more dates. We had dinner at a cozy Italian place in Lincoln Park, grabbed coffee at a little cafe near my apartment, and even took a walk along the lakefront. I could tell Jake was interested in something more serious, but I started to notice little things that didn't sit right with me. He seemed to be a bit too eager, texting constantly and wanting to see me almost every day. At first, I chalked it up to him being really into me, but as someone who values their space, it started to feel a little overwhelming. Then there was the way he would get a bit too intense when talking about his feelings for me, even though we had only known each other for a few weeks. I decided to slow things down and told Jake that I wasn't looking for anything serious at the moment. He seemed to take it well at first, saying he understood and respected my decision. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. The next day, Jake started texting me more frequently, asking to meet up or just checking in. When I didn't respond right away, he'd send follow-up messages, asking if everything was okay or if he had done something to upset me. I tried to be polite but firm, reiterating that I needed some space. But Jake didn't seem to get the message. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find a bouquet of flowers on my doorstep. There was no note, but I had a pretty good idea who they were from. I texted Jake, asking if he had sent them, and he confirmed that he had. I thanked him, but reminded him that I needed some time to myself. He responded with a simple, "Okay." I hoped that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. Over the next few days, I noticed Jake seemed to be popping up wherever I went. I'd see him at the grocery store, at my favorite coffee shop, even outside my apartment building. Each time, he'd act surprised to see me, as if it were a complete coincidence. But the chances of us running into each other that often in a city the size of Chicago were slim to none. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to go for a run along the lakefront trail. I hadn't told anyone about my plans, so I was shocked when, halfway through my run, I saw Jake coming toward me. He waved and jogged up to me, saying he had just been in the area and thought he'd join me. I was so startled that I didn't know what to say. We ended up running together for a bit before I made an excuse about needing to head home. When I got back to my apartment, I started to feel uneasy. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was getting harder to ignore the nagging feeling that Jake was deliberately trying to bump into me. I decided to take a break from Tinder and focus on myself for a while. I stopped responding to Jake's messages and didn't log into the app for a few days. That's when things started to get really creepy. One evening, I was heading out to meet a friend for dinner when I noticed something on my car windshield. It was a note written in messy handwriting that said, "You can't hide from me forever." My heart dropped. There was no signature, but I had a sinking feeling it was from Jake. I called my friend and canceled our plans, feeling too shaken to go out. I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself that it was just a prank, or maybe someone else had left the note on the wrong car. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I woke up to find a series of missed calls and messages from Jake. He was apologizing, saying he didn't mean to scare me and just wanted to talk. I blocked his number, hoping that would be the end of it. But the calls and messages didn't stop. He started using different numbers, and when I blocked those, he began emailing me and messaging me on social media. I blocked him everywhere I could think of, but he always seemed to find a way to reach me. Then one night I was coming home from work when I saw Jake standing outside my apartment building. He was just standing there looking at the entrance, as if he were waiting for me. I froze, unsure of what to do. He hadn't seen me yet, so I turned around and walked in the opposite direction, my heart pounding in my chest. I ended up staying at a friend's place that night, too scared to go home. The next day, I went to the leasing office and asked if I could change apartments. They were sympathetic but said they didn't have any available units. I didn't want to get the police involved just yet, so I decided to stay with friends for a while and see if things would calm down. But Jake didn't stop. He started showing up at my workplace, waiting outside when I got off work. My co-workers noticed and asked if everything was okay, but I didn't know how to explain what was happening. I felt like I was losing control of my life, constantly looking over my shoulder and wondering when Jake would show up next. One day, after yet another run-in with Jake, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the police and filed a restraining order against him. They took my statement and assured me they would handle it, but I couldn't help feeling like it was too little, too late. For a while, things seemed to calm down. I stopped seeing Jake around, and the calls and messages finally stopped. I started to feel like maybe I could get back to my normal life. But the fear never really went away. I was always on edge, always wondering if Jake was still out there, waiting for the right moment to reappear. One evening, about a month after I had filed the restraining order, I was leaving work when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the windshield of my car, was another note. This one was shorter than the last, just 3 words, "I'll be back." I drove straight to the police station and showed them the note. They took it seriously and assured me they would increase patrols around my apartment and workplace, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. I couldn't keep living in fear, waiting for Jake to make his next move. So I made a decision. I packed up my things, broke my lease, and moved to a new city. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts, and did everything I could to erase any trace of my old life. It's been a few months now, and I'm starting to feel a little safer. I've made some new friends, found a new job, and am slowly rebuilding my life. But the fear is still there, lurking in the back of my mind. Every time I see a car that looks like Jake's or someone who resembles him, my heart skips a beat. I don't know if I'll ever fully get over what happened, but I'm trying to move on. It all started about a year ago when I matched with a guy named David on Tinder. I was living in Seattle at the time, working a demanding job in marketing, and my social life had taken a bit of a backseat. Tinder was an easy way to meet people without too much effort, and I'd had a few casual dates, but nothing serious. Then David came along. David's profile caught my eye right away. He was well dressed in every photo, smiling confidently with a kind of charm that felt genuine. His bio mentioned that he was an entrepreneur in the tech industry, a world I was familiar with given that I lived in Seattle. We started chatting, and I was immediately drawn to how articulate and interesting he was. He talked about his work, his passion for traveling, and his love for good food. He seemed like the total package. After a few days of messaging back and forth, we decided to meet up for dinner at a nice restaurant downtown. I was a little nervous because he seemed so put together, and I didn't want to come across as boring or unimpressive. But from the moment we met in person, David put me at ease. He was charming, attentive, and knew how to make me laugh. The conversation flowed naturally, and by the end of the night, I was convinced I had met someone really special. We started dating regularly, and every time we went out, it felt like I was getting closer to someone who could really be a part of my life. David would take me to upscale restaurants, introduce me to new wines, and talk about the exciting projects he was working on. He was always so confident and seemed to know everyone wherever we went. He even talked about the potential of us working together in the future, as he was looking to expand his business and thought my marketing skills could be a great asset. As the weeks went by, I found myself falling for him. He was everything I had been looking for: successful, kind, and genuinely interested in me. Or so I thought. One night, about 2 months into our relationship, David mentioned that he was dealing with a financial snag related to one of his business ventures. He explained that it was a temporary issue, something about an investment that hadn't come through as expected. He seemed stressed, which was unusual for him, and casually mentioned that he might need a loan to cover some costs until things got sorted out. He assured me it was just a short-term problem, and that he would pay me back with interest. At first, I was hesitant. I'd never been in a situation where a boyfriend asked me for money, and it didn't sit right with me. But David was so convincing, and I didn't want to seem unsupportive. He made it sound like it was no big deal, just a temporary hiccup in an otherwise thriving business. After thinking it over, I decided to help him out. I transferred a significant amount of money to his account, trusting that he would pay me back as soon as he could. After that, things seemed to return to normal. David was back to his charming self, and we continued going out and enjoying our time together. But then, about a week after I had lent him the money, I started to notice some strange changes. He became less communicative, not responding to my texts as quickly and canceling plans at the last minute. When we did meet up, he seemed distracted, his usual confidence replaced by a sort of nervous energy that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to brush it off, thinking that maybe he was just stressed about work, but the nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. Then one day, I got a message from David saying that he had to leave town unexpectedly for a business trip. He didn't give me many details, just that it was urgent and he'd be out of contact for a while. I was disappointed but didn't want to seem needy. So I wished him luck and hoped to hear from him soon. But I didn't hear from him. Days turned into weeks, and every time I tried to reach out, my messages went unanswered. His phone went straight to voicemail, and he wasn't active on any of his social media accounts. I started to panic, realizing that something was seriously wrong. I decided to do some digging. I had met a few of David's friends during our time together, so I reached out to one of them, a guy named Eric who worked in the same industry. When I asked if he had heard from David, Eric seemed confused. He told me that he hadn't seen or spoken to David in months and was under the impression that David had moved out of the city. My heart sank. Eric then dropped a bombshell. He had heard rumors that David was involved in some shady business deals and that he had a reputation for conning people out of money. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything about David suddenly seemed suspicious. I started looking deeper, searching for any trace of him online, and that's when I found a forum where people were discussing experiences with con artists. My stomach churned as I read post after post describing situations eerily similar to mine. Women from different cities had all met a man who sounded exactly like David. Same looks, same story, same scam. He would charm them, gain their trust, and then disappear with their money. I was devastated. I had been so careful, so sure that I was smart enough to avoid getting scammed, and yet here I was. The more I dug, the more I realized just how much of my life David had infiltrated. He had woven himself into my world, met my friends, and even talked about a future together, all while planning to con me out of my money. I tried to track him down, contacting the authorities, and even hiring a private investigator. But it was like he had vanished into thin air. The email address he had used was deactivated, and the phone number no longer worked. The address he had given me for his apartment turned out to be a short-term rental that he had vacated weeks before. It became clear that David, or whatever his real name was, had done this many times before and knew exactly how to cover his tracks. I was embarrassed, ashamed that I had been so easily deceived, and angry that someone could be so heartless. But more than anything, I felt violated. David hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my trust, my sense of security, and my belief in the goodness of people. I felt stupid for falling for it, for ignoring the small red flags because I wanted so badly to believe that he was genuine. I eventually had to accept that the money was gone and that I would probably never see David again. I reported the scam to the police and shared my story on the same forums where I had found other victims, hoping that maybe my experience would help someone else avoid the same fate. But there wasn't much more I could do. I had to move on and try to rebuild my life piece by piece. I had been using Tinder on and off for a while and had gone on a few dates, nothing too serious. Then one day I matched with Rebecca. She seemed sweet, down to earth, and shared a lot of the same interests as me. We both loved exploring the city's hidden gems, trying new restaurants, and hiking on weekends. Our conversations were easy and fun, and before long, we decided to meet up. We arranged to have dinner at a trendy little spot in the West Village. The evening went well. Rebecca was just as charming in person as she was online. We spent hours talking about everything, from our favorite movies to our childhood memories. After that first date, we kept seeing each other regularly, and it felt like we were really hitting it off. A few weeks into dating, I started feeling off. It wasn't anything major at first, just a little more tired than usual, the occasional headache. I chalked it up to work stress or the change in the weather. But as time went on, my symptoms got worse. I started having these intense headaches that wouldn't go away, dizziness that made it hard to concentrate, and a constant feeling of fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to fix. Rebecca was very supportive, always checking in on me and offering to help out whenever she could. She would bring me soup when I wasn't feeling well, and even offered to do my grocery shopping when I felt too weak to leave the apartment. I appreciated her concern, but I was getting worried. I had never felt like this before, and it didn't seem to be going away. I went to see a doctor who ran a series of tests. Everything came back normal. No sign of any serious illness, no obvious cause for my symptoms. The doctor suggested it might be stress-related and recommended some lifestyle changes like getting more exercise and eating healthier. I tried to follow his advice, but nothing seemed to help. The symptoms persisted, and I started to feel like I was losing control of my life. Rebecca continued to be there for me, but something about her behavior started to feel a little off. She was always around, even when I didn't ask for her help. She would show up at my apartment unexpectedly, bringing food or offering to clean up. I appreciated her efforts, but I started to feel smothered. I didn't want to seem ungrateful, so I kept my concerns to myself. One evening, I was lying in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep, when I started thinking about how all of this had started right after I began dating Rebecca. It was probably just a coincidence, but the thought kept nagging at me. I decided to look into it, just to put my mind at ease. I started with a simple Google search, Rebecca's name and a few keywords related to my symptoms. At first, nothing came up, but then I found a forum post from a guy in Brooklyn who described a similar experience. He had met a woman named Rebecca on Tinder, started dating her, and then mysteriously fallen ill with symptoms that sounded exactly like mine. His post was a few years old and he didn't provide much detail, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. I reached out to him, hoping to get more information. He responded a few days later, telling me that his symptoms had eventually gone away after he stopped seeing Rebecca. He never found out what caused his illness, but he suspected that something was off about her. He mentioned that after he ended things, he started to hear stories from mutual friends about Rebecca's past relationships, all of which seemed to end with the guy getting mysteriously sick. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to distance myself from Rebecca, making excuses to avoid seeing her. I wanted to see if my symptoms would improve without her around. And to my surprise, they did. The headaches became less frequent, the dizziness subsided, and I started to feel like myself again. That's when I knew I had to dig deeper. I went through my apartment, looking for anything that seemed out of place. I checked my medicine cabinet, my kitchen, anywhere Rebecca might have had access to. Everything seemed normal at first, but then I found something strange. Tucked away in the back of a drawer in my bathroom, behind some old toiletries I hadn't used in ages, was a small vial. It was unlabeled and I had no idea what it was or how it had gotten there. I started to feel a sense of dread. What if this was the cause of my illness? What if Rebecca had something to do with it? I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore the evidence. I took the vial to a friend of mine who worked in a lab. He wasn't able to identify exactly what was in it, but he said it could be some kind of chemical or toxin. He advised me to go to the police, but I was hesitant. I didn't have any concrete proof that Rebecca had done anything wrong, and I didn't want to accuse her without being sure. Instead, I decided to confront her. I told her I had found something strange in my apartment and asked if she knew anything about it. She denied knowing anything, but her reaction was off. She seemed nervous, almost panicked, and kept trying to change the subject. I didn't press the issue, but I knew then that I had to end things with her. I told her that I needed to focus on my health and that I couldn't continue seeing her. She didn't take it well. She became upset, accusing me of abandoning her when she had been there for me. I tried to be as gentle as possible, but I was firm in my decision. After we broke up, I started to feel better almost immediately. The symptoms that had plagued me for months slowly disappeared, and I began to regain my energy. I never heard from Rebecca again, and to this day, I'm not sure what really happened. I don't know if she intentionally did something to make me sick or if it was all just a bizarre coincidence, but the experience left me shaken, and I've been much more cautious about who I let into my life since then. My story started a little over a year ago when I matched with a guy named Tom. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, working as a graphic designer. Like many others, I used Tinder mostly out of boredom, scrolling through profiles whenever I had a spare moment. I wasn't really looking for anything serious, but when I matched with Tom, I was intrigued. Tom's profile was impressive. He was in his early 30s, worked as a financial analyst, and had a smile that could light up a room. He seemed successful, confident, and had this laid-back vibe that immediately drew me in. We started chatting, and it didn't take long for me to realize that we had a lot in common. We both loved hiking, trying new restaurants, and exploring different neighborhoods in LA. After a few days of texting, we decided to meet up. Our first date was at a trendy little bar in Silver Lake. From the moment we met, I was struck by how easy he was to talk to. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. We talked for hours, and by the end of the night, I was already looking forward to seeing him again. We started dating regularly, and over the next couple of months, everything seemed perfect. Tom was everything I could have hoped for in a partner. He was supportive, thoughtful, and always made time for me despite his busy work schedule. We spent weekends hiking in Griffith Park, trying new food trucks, and watching movies at his place. He had this ability to make me feel safe and cared for, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I started to let my guard down and really let him into my life. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice some strange behavior. It wasn't anything overt at first, just little things that seemed off. Tom would get these mysterious phone calls that he always took in another room. He would come back looking tense, but when I asked about it, he brushed it off as work stuff. I didn't want to pry, so I let it go. Then there were the nights when he would suddenly have to leave, claiming there was an emergency at work. He would disappear for hours and wouldn't respond to my texts or calls. When he came back, he would be distant, distracted, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. I tried to convince myself that it was just the stress of his job, but the more it happened, the more uneasy I felt. One night, after we had spent the day together, Tom received another one of those calls. He stepped outside to take it, but this time I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion in my gut. I quietly followed him to the door and overheard bits of his conversation. He was speaking in a low, urgent tone, using phrases that didn't make sense to me. Something about moving the package and meeting at the usual spot. My heart started racing. I had no idea what he was talking about, but it didn't sound like anything related to finance. When he came back inside, he was visibly shaken. I asked him if everything was okay, and he just nodded, giving me a forced smile. He said he had to leave for a bit and that he'd call me later. I tried to act normal, but I was terrified. As soon as he left, I started searching his name online, looking for anything that might explain what was going on. What I found left me cold. There were several news articles mentioning a man with Tom's full name involved in criminal activities, specifically related to organized crime. The details were vague, but the more I read, the more I realized that the man in the articles matched the description of the Tom I knew. I was in shock. I had been dating this guy for months, and now it seemed like he was involved in something dangerous, something that could put me at risk just by being associated with him. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront him, demand answers, but another part of me was terrified of what I might find out. I decided to wait, to see if there was some kind of explanation that didn't involve him being a criminal. But as the days passed, Tom's behavior became more erratic. He started showing up at my place unannounced, often late at night, looking anxious and on edge. He wouldn't say much, just that he needed to stay over because his place wasn't safe. I was scared, but I didn't know how to get out of the situation. I started avoiding him, making excuses to not see him, but he always seemed to find a way to insert himself back into my life. The final straw came one night when he showed up at my apartment with a duffel bag and a look in his eyes that I'll never forget. He told me that he needed to leave town for a while and that I shouldn't try to contact him. He wouldn't explain why or where he was going, just that it was for my safety. He kissed me on the forehead and left, disappearing into the night. I was left standing in my doorway, too stunned to move. After that, I didn't hear from him for weeks. I was a mess, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if he was going to come back or if someone else might show up in his place. I didn't feel safe in my own home, and I started to regret ever swiping right on his profile. Eventually, I found out through a mutual acquaintance that Tom had been arrested. The details were hazy, but it was clear that he had been involved in something illegal, something dangerous. I was relieved that he was out of my life, but the experience left me traumatized. I've always been pretty cautious when it comes to online dating. Living in Boston, I've heard my fair share of horror stories about people who met someone online, only to find out they weren't who they seemed to be. But when I matched with Paul on Tinder, I didn't get that vibe at all. In fact, he seemed like the exact opposite of the typical Tinder nightmare guy. He was polite, well-spoken, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. Paul was 34, worked as a software engineer, and had recently moved to Boston from Chicago. His profile was simple, with a few pictures of him hiking, enjoying coffee at a cafe, and smiling warmly. There wasn't anything flashy or over-the-top about him, which I found refreshing. We started chatting, and I was struck by how considerate he was. He asked about my day, my work, and even remembered little details I mentioned in passing. After a few days of messaging, we decided to meet up for dinner. We met at a cozy little Italian restaurant in the North End. Paul was just as friendly and respectful in person as he had been online. He opened doors for me, listened attentively, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. The conversation flowed easily, and by the end of the night, I felt like I had met someone who was truly different from the usual online dating crowd. He walked me to my car, and we parted ways with a promise to see each other again. Over the next few weeks, Paul and I continued to see each other regularly. We went on more dates, ranging from dinners at nice restaurants to casual walks along the Charles River. He was always kind, never pushy, and seemed to really value my comfort and feelings. It was a refreshing change from some of the other guys I dated, who often seemed more interested in themselves than in actually getting to know me. After about a month of dating, I felt comfortable enough to invite Paul over to my apartment. I lived in a small but cozy place in Cambridge, and I thought it would be nice to have a quiet evening in. Paul arrived with a bottle of wine and some flowers, which I thought was incredibly sweet. We cooked dinner together, watched a movie, and just enjoyed each other's company. Everything felt perfect. That night, Paul stayed over for the first time. The next morning, however, things started to change. I woke up to find him staring at me, which was a bit unsettling. He quickly smiled and said he was just admiring how peaceful I looked while sleeping, but something about it felt off. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. But over the next few days, Paul's behavior started to shift. He became more critical, making little comments about the way I dressed, the food I ate, or even the way I talked. At first it was subtle, just a remark here or there, but it quickly escalated. He started questioning my choices, making comments such as that my clothing didn't suit me and that my food choices were unhealthy. These comments caught me off guard because they were so different from the kind, considerate person I had been dating. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just trying to be helpful, but the criticism kept coming. He started making veiled threats, suggesting that if I didn't start taking better care of myself, he might not be able to stay with me. It was confusing and hurtful, especially since he had been so sweet in the beginning. I began to feel like I couldn't do anything right, that no matter what I did, it wouldn't be good enough for him. The worst part was how he would turn it around on me whenever I tried to talk about how his comments made me feel. He would say things such as that he was just looking out for me, or that he wouldn't say these things if he didn't care, which made me doubt myself, made me wonder if maybe I was overreacting or being too sensitive. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Paul also became increasingly possessive. He would text me constantly, wanting to know where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing. If I didn't respond right away, he'd accuse me of ignoring him or lying about what I was up to. It felt suffocating, like I was being watched and judged all the time. I started to dread seeing his name pop up on my phone, knowing it would probably lead to another argument or another criticism. One night, things came to a head. We were out at a restaurant, and Paul started criticizing the way I was eating, saying I was being unladylike and that I needed to be more refined. I was fed up and told him that he was being rude and that I didn't appreciate his constant negativity. Instead of apologizing, he leaned in close and warned in a low voice that I should be cautious about how I spoke to him, implying that angering him could have consequences. It was like a switch flipped in my mind. In that moment, I realized that the kind, caring guy I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone who was manipulative and controlling. I felt a wave of fear and anger wash over me, but I managed to keep my composure. I told him I needed to go to the bathroom and walked away, trying to figure out what to do. In the bathroom, I called a friend and told her everything that had been happening. She was horrified and insisted that I leave immediately. I agreed and made up my mind to end things with Paul. When I returned to the table, I told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. He tried to argue, but I was firm. I left the restaurant and drove straight to my friend's place, where I spent the night. The next day, I blocked Paul on everything: my phone, social media, even email. I didn't want to give him any way to contact me. I was done with him and his manipulation. But even after I cut him off, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. I kept wondering how someone could change so drastically, or if the person I thought I knew had ever really existed. I've used Tinder on and off for a few years, mostly for fun and casual dating. I live in Denver, and I've had some decent experiences. But last year, I had an experience that still haunts me to this day, something that made me question everything about online dating. I matched with a woman named Lucy. She seemed perfect, beautiful, smart, and funny. Her profile was filled with pictures of her hiking in the Rockies, exploring local breweries, and enjoying life. We started chatting, and she quickly became one of the most interesting people I'd ever met on the app. We talked about everything: our favorite trails, the best restaurants in Denver, and even more personal things like our families and childhood memories. After a few weeks of messaging, we decided to meet in person. We agreed on a small coffee shop in the Highlands, a place I frequented often. I was excited, but also a little nervous. It's always a bit nerve-wracking to meet someone you've only talked to online, but Lucy had been so open and engaging in our conversations that I was more excited than anything else. When I arrived at the coffee shop, I spotted her right away. She looked a little different from her photos, but not in a way that set off any alarms, just a bit more casual maybe. We sat down, got our coffee, and started talking. At first, everything seemed fine. She was friendly and easy to talk to, just like she had been online. But as the conversation went on, I started to notice little things that didn't add up. She didn't seem to remember some of the details we had talked about before, like the specific hiking trails I loved or the restaurant we had both agreed was the best in the city. It was small stuff, but it was strange, especially since we had talked about these things more than once. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she was just nervous or that my expectations were too high. But as the date went on, more red flags started popping up. Her stories about her job and her life in Denver didn't quite match what she had told me before. When I asked about her family, she gave vague, almost rehearsed answers that felt off. There was something about her that just didn't feel right. Despite the odd vibe, we decided to meet up again. I figured maybe it was just first date nerves and that things would be more relaxed the second time around. But our second date only made things weirder. We met for drinks at a bar downtown, and this time I couldn't shake the feeling that Lucy was hiding something. She was evasive whenever I tried to ask about her past, and her answers to simple questions didn't make sense. For example, when I asked her about her favorite places in Denver, she mentioned spots that didn't exist or gave me directions that led nowhere. By this point, I was seriously starting to doubt that Lucy was who she said she was. After the date, I decided to do a little digging. I searched her name online, looking for any social media profiles or public records that might help me figure out what was going on, but I couldn't find anything that matched the details she had given me. The more I searched, the more I realized that the Lucy I had been talking to didn't seem to exist outside of Tinder. Feeling uneasy, I reached out to a friend who worked in IT and asked him to help me look into it further. He was able to find some information that I hadn't been able to access on my own. What he found was disturbing. The photos on Lucy's Tinder profile weren't hers. They belonged to a woman from another state who had been reported missing over a year ago. The details Lucy had given me about her life, her job, and even her family were all fake. It was like the person I had been talking to didn't exist at all. I was freaked out. I didn't know who this woman was or what her intentions were, but I knew I needed to get out of the situation immediately. I blocked her on Tinder, deleted her contact information, and stopped responding to her messages. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened and why someone would go to such lengths to create a fake identity. A few days later, I came home from work to find that my apartment had been broken into. Nothing was stolen, but it was clear that someone had been inside. The door had been forced open, and a few things were out of place. My heart sank as I realized that it might be connected to Lucy or whoever she really was. I reported the break-in to the police, but without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a message that chilled me to the bone. The text simply read, "You shouldn't have looked into me." There was no name, no other details, just those 6 words. I moved out of my apartment the next day. I didn't feel safe there anymore, knowing that someone who had gone to such great lengths to deceive me had now been inside my home. I stayed with friends for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. The whole experience left me paranoid and afraid to trust anyone. I still don't know who Lucy really was or what she wanted. I never heard from her again after that message, and part of me hopes I never will. I've been using Tinder for a while, mostly for fun and meeting new people. Living in Austin, Texas, it's easy to find someone to grab a drink with or go out on a casual date. I've had some good experiences and a few awkward ones, but nothing really prepared me for what happened with Mark. It all started so casually, and I thought it would just be a nice, friendly connection, but it quickly turned into something much more disturbing. I matched with Mark last fall. His profile was pretty standard. He looked like an average guy, nothing flashy or overly charming. He worked in IT, was originally from Dallas, and had moved to Austin a few years ago. We started chatting, and he seemed nice enough. There wasn't a huge spark, but he was friendly and had a good sense of humor. After a few days of messaging, we decided to meet up for a drink at a local bar on Rainy Street. The first date was fine. We had a couple of beers, talked about work, hobbies, and our favorite spots in the city. There wasn't much of a romantic connection on my end, but I thought we could be friends. Mark seemed to feel the same way, or at least that's what I assumed when he suggested we hang out again, but in a more casual, just friends kind of way. I didn't see any harm in it, so I agreed. Over the next couple of weeks, we met up a few times, once for coffee, another time for a walk around Zilker Park, and even a quick lunch downtown. Every time we hung out, Mark would always suggest doing something else the next day or later in the week. I started to get the feeling that he wanted to hang out a bit more than I did, but I didn't want to be rude. I thought maybe he was just lonely or new to the city and trying to make friends. One evening, I was at home catching up on some work when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was a little surprised. I opened the door and there was Mark, standing there with a 6-pack of beer and a grin on his face. He said he was in the neighborhood and thought he'd stop by. I was caught off guard but didn't want to be rude, so I let him in. We ended up watching a movie and he stayed for a couple of hours. It wasn't a big deal, but the whole thing felt a little odd. I hadn't given him my address, so I wondered how he knew where I lived. When I asked, he brushed it off, saying he had seen my apartment building in the background of a photo I posted on Instagram. That explanation made me uncomfortable, but I didn't want to overreact. After that night, Mark started showing up more often. He'd randomly appear at my place saying he was just in the neighborhood, or that he had been thinking about me and wanted to see if I was free. Sometimes he'd bring food or drinks. Other times he'd just show up empty-handed, expecting to hang out. It was starting to feel intrusive, but I didn't know how to tell him to stop without seeming mean. Things escalated when I came home from work one day to find Mark sitting on my couch. I had given him a spare key a week earlier when he'd offered to wait for a package delivery while I was at work. I had forgotten to ask for it back, and now he was using it to let himself in whenever he felt like it. He seemed to think it was perfectly normal, but I was freaked out. I asked him to leave, and he did, but not without acting hurt, like I had done something wrong. I immediately changed the locks and sent Mark a message saying that I needed some space and that it wasn't okay for him to just show up unannounced. He apologized, but his tone was passive-aggressive, like he didn't really understand why I was upset. For a few days, I didn't hear from him, and I started to relax, thinking maybe he'd gotten the message. But then the random visits started again. I'd come home and find small things left outside my door. Flowers, takeout from my favorite restaurant, a book he thought I'd like. It was all too much, and it was starting to scare me. One night, I came home late after a long day at work and found Mark sitting on the steps of my building. He looked disheveled and upset. He said he missed hanging out and didn't understand why I was avoiding him. I tried to stay calm and told him again that I needed space and that he was crossing boundaries. He didn't take it well and started getting defensive, saying he thought we were friends and that friends don't just ignore each other. At that point, I was genuinely scared. I told him I didn't want to see him anymore and that he needed to leave me alone. He stormed off, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite make out. I went inside, locked the door, and sat on my couch, feeling completely shaken. I hoped that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The next day, I started getting messages from Mark, alternating between apologizing and blaming me for leading him on. I blocked his number, but then he started emailing me, creating new accounts when I blocked each one. He even tried to contact me through social media using fake profiles. I blocked everything I could think of, but the messages kept coming. Then, one night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of someone trying to open my door. I froze listening as the handle jiggled, followed by a loud knock. My heart was pounding as I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Mark, standing there with this desperate look on his face. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to open the door, but I also didn't want him to keep banging on it and wake up my neighbors. I ended up calling the police, and when they arrived, Mark was still there, pleading with me to let him in. The officers talked to him, and he finally left, but not before giving me this look that I'll never forget, like I had betrayed him. After that incident, I got a restraining order against Mark. It was a painful process, and I hated that it had come to this, but I didn't feel safe otherwise. The police took it seriously, and for a while Mark stayed away. But the fear didn't go away. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if he was going to show up again. I tried to go about my life, but the anxiety was overwhelming. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, expecting it to be another message from him. I started avoiding places we had gone together, even though I loved those spots. I became paranoid about people finding out where I lived, and I barely used social media anymore. One day I was walking home from work when I saw Mark standing across the street from my apartment. He didn't approach me, just stood there, watching. I hurried inside and called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. I knew then that I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I needed to get away from him, from everything. I broke my lease and moved to a different part of the city, hoping that distance would help me feel safe again. It's been a few months and things have been better, but I still feel uneasy.
Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.